kickoff of the rare disease drug strategy. And what you'll see throughout the webinar series is really how do we build this smart? And really, how do we build it so it's fit for purpose and really fit for purpose into the future? So next slide, Ann, or Bill, whoever's doing it. So the first one is actually quite timely because this will be a core of many of the sessions coming forth, but this really focuses on something that is quite apropos, the application of real world evidence in drug access decision-making. And it really builds on, quite serendipitously, quite frankly, because we were thinking about this, but a few weeks ago, ISPOR did a forum on the delivering evidence-based access in rare diseases, the challenges in SMA, and used SMA as a case study, which was where we were heading already. So it was a great opportunity to actually be able to hear it being discussed in an international forum because it came out of ISPOR, but it really driven out the European experience. And it's where I also heard our keynote presenter here. So the questions we want to ask is how could and should real world evidence be meaningfully used in access decisions? And our goal, with the goal of being able to collect real world evidence, analyzing these, understand the impact, and how do we apply real world evidence to update criteria, conditions for usage or discontinuation and measure of long-term impact? So the two are really connected, right? How do we bring it into the decisions? And then how do we continuously update our decisions based on the accumulation of real world evidence? And we're going to use in the case of spinal muscular atrophy, which is very timely and actually has certainly a timeliness here, but also coming out of the experiences specifically in the European context. Next slide. So yeah, this is really taken from a paper that was led off by Karen Fassi, which talked about, the European context of looking at real world evidence for decisions and what is being done internationally. And I won't go through all of this, but they actually came up with some recommendations at the end of it. They did a great forum bringing together multiple stakeholders. And the two key themes they really came back with was we need to have collaboration and collaboration early and upfront and really in a joint problem solving environment, and also transparency, which is key. And I remember way back when, even when we started talking about HTA, is that if the rules aren't perfectly understandable and consistent, the best we can hope for is to have transparency. So people know how we arrived at the decisions we arrive at and can query it. Next question, the next slide, sorry. So here's our presenters I'm really excited about. We have Susie, who is Vanderwick, who is the lead for Cure SMA Canada, Angela Paradis, Scientific Director from Biogen, coming to us from Cambridge today, Bruce Carlton, BC Children's Hospital, Fred Little, the country lead for rare diseases in Canada, Pfizer, Alison Drinkwater, who is with us from NMR. Hopefully Brad is on. I haven't seen him yet, but from Cord Board, and Brent Fraser, who's the Vice President of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CATA. So we'll move right into, I think I had a few more introductions, but maybe Angela, if you can just put that up, maybe I'll skip most of it so that we can get into Susie and Angela's presentation.
I think that was about it for slides.
No, Angela has a slide deck.
Okay, good. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so this kind of shares some of the same questions that we'd had before. I won't go into a long introduction to it. It'll be on the form that you can get, but let's move right directly into it. Yeah. So what we're going to do in this particular discussion, I'm not reading the first part of it. Why is this a little bit off kilter? It is a case study around SMA. So what are the SMA patient application? Okay, what is SMA? How can it be treated? What's the experience living with SMA? The value of the medicines? What are SMA patient registries, and how do these registries and other sources of patient data contribute to collection of real world evidence? And then we will have the panel discussion who can talk to us about what constitutes real world data or real world evidence from the perspective of different stakeholders. So hopefully we'll have a good, robust discussion, because I think, as we all know, there's no consensus yet in terms of what constitutes evidence, how that evidence can be used, what constitutes validity in it, and certainly how do we apply them consistently. What can we learn from this case study, and how should we be thinking about recommendations moving forward? And I don't know that we're going to get into the AI components here, but we will have some couple future sessions that really will focus on the application of AI into what we're hoping is going to be a very smart rare disease drug strategy. Okay, so the case study of SMA, learning and applications, that's enough here. I think we did some of that. Okay, if you don't mind, we're going to skip right into move into comments from Susie Vanderwick, who is long-term patient advocate, but also a lot of personal experiences in terms of SMA. Susie, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, I'm Susie Vanderwick, like Duran said. I'm the Executive Director of Cure SMA Canada, but I'm also the mother of a young lady, 25 years old, that has spinal muscular atrophy, which has led me down this road of advocacy and role with the organization. I guess just a very short overview of what spinal muscular atrophy is. It's the degeneration of the nerve cells of the body. It never affects the patient's cognitive ability. We have several types. Type 1 is the most prevalent, with 63% of the patients being affected by type 1. They're usually diagnosed shortly after birth and usually pass away by the age of 2, untreated. Type 2, they're usually diagnosed before the age of 2. They never reach the ability to walk. And, they live a life in a power wheelchair, and, that they have an early death is what it is. And that is the type my daughter has. Type 3, they have reached the ability to walk and may walk into adulthood, but will eventually end up in a chair as well. And type 4 is adult onset, may or may not end up in a wheelchair. So what we have experienced is a lifetime for these adult patients who we're here to discuss, who have waited a lifetime for access to treatment, have been progressing during their lifetime, and have been unable to access treatment to date. So 2019, we had spinal muscular atrophy, had Spinraza approved. But unfortunately, the clinical trial data only included patients up to the age of 12 and only type 1 and 2. So the advocacy was not only to approve to that set of patients, but also beyond that, so that we could have patients who were outside that narrow window of inclusion criteria also benefit from the treatment. Side note, for us as patients, we know, the physicians know, that just because we have patients up to the age of 12 that are non-ambulant, approving the value of the treatment, patients beyond that, obviously, are also going to benefit from the treatment. So the approval for us up to that narrow set is really, really upsetting. And in fact, the consequences of having treatment approved and not include patients outside of the inclusion criteria has really devastating ripple effects. After Spinraza was approved, we had Zolgensma come into play, which was only for up to the age of 2. Risdiplam was shortly after that, an oral treatment. We had very high hopes for the adult patients that we would finally be able to receive access for our adults, but unfortunately, it also was approved just to the inclusion criteria for non-ambulant patients up to the age of 25. So now we have Canadian patients outside of Quebec, because Quebec did approve for all patients and types. We have access limited for patients over the age of 25 within all provinces. The consequences is for patients who are adults that are not able to access, we have broken family structure, we have loss of jobs, we have isolation, loss of function, decline in mental health, and ultimately death. And not dramatic, that is fact. So consequences to the community is patients' dramatic shift from fighting their disease to feelings of surrendering to the disease. They feel inconsequential. They consider self-harm. Fingers are pointed at the patient groups, feeling we just didn't try hard enough for and that our priority is just children, and that the holy dollar has value, more value than their life. And ultimately, death is the final destination for our patients. And that's fact.
Thank you so much, Susie. And I know that you have been absolutely the tireless lead in terms of advocacy, and it's been an amazing journey. And as you say, we've seen so much happen on behalf of the SMA community in Canada. A lot of it, due to your leadership from every area in terms of getting access to diagnosis, getting access to treatment, getting access to comprehensive care. And yet, as you say, you look at your own daughter and say, not yet. And that must be heartbreaking. So thank you again for all you do. I'm going to turn it now to Angela. And Angela, will you walk us through kind of where you folks are in terms of the collection of and the application for real world evidence?
You're on mute, Angela.
Apologies, that's not a good way to start, but I would like to start by saying thank you, especially to Doreen for inviting me to be here today. It's certainly my pleasure to be part of this panel to discuss some of the opportunities and challenges in the generation and use of real world data, particularly clinical effectiveness data in rare health conditions such as spinal muscular atrophy. And so if we go to the next slide, thank you. Here are my disclosures, and we can move forward. Great. And so while clinical trials remain the gold standard for establishing the efficacy and safety of disease-modifying therapies, there is certainly widespread recognition that not all needed data will be generated from clinical trials, and this is certainly the case in SMA. For example, while clinical trials typically focus on homogeneous, highly selected patient populations, real-world studies allow us to assess the effectiveness and safety of a treatment in larger heterogeneous populations and really enhance the understanding of longer-term outcomes. And if we advance further, we'll see here the clinical trials that have been conducted within SMA for the approved therapies. And what should become quickly apparent is that SMA clinical trials have primarily included infants and children, as Susie mentioned. And this is certainly for good reason, given the increased severity of the disease when symptoms begin early in life. But at the same time, it really has left questions about the potential treatment benefits in older patients, particularly adults, which accounts for a large proportion of the prevalent SMA population. And much of the evidence to support and inform the safe and effective use of nusinersen in adults has really accumulated from the real world clinical practice and has been captured in disease registries, as we'll discuss further. As we'll see on the next slide, there are varied sources of real world data, including disease registries, that typically rely on the collection of data in the context of usual clinical practice. And the choice of data source should always follow the key scientific questions to be addressed. But disease registries that enroll patients independent of their treatment status or use of a particular therapy can play an essential role in the generation of data, especially in rare disease. And a number of different types of questions can be addressed, including those related to treatment effectiveness, the identification of predictors of or time to response, and comparisons between treatments. On the next slide, we'll see here that Biogen has broadly supported an SMA disease registry approach with multiple partners, really with the goal of establishing a global collaborative network of SMA registries led by academic clinicians. And so over the past 6 years, work has been undertaken to improve the capacity and capability of these independent registries to collect valid and reliable patient-level data. And we're really supporting efforts to standardize data across registries to an internationally aligned core minimum data set and provide financial support to implement data collection and ensure sustainability. And the objectives really shown here center on documenting the natural history when we can of SMA in certain subpopulations that hadn't been well studied in the pre-DMT treatment era, really to enable the characterization of treatment patterns and outcomes. And through the generation of these types of data, the SMA disease registries have been utilized to help fulfill post-authorization commitments and data needs of payers. On the next slide, we'll see the registries or the locations of the registries that we are funding across the globe. And it's important to note that these registries are owned by the academic clinicians rather than Biogen. And we really appreciate them as a valuable data source that can benefit the whole SMA community, including individuals with SMA and their families, healthcare providers, researchers, regulators, payers, and industry as well. And in the multi-treatment landscape that we're currently in, it is important that these registries include data on all available therapies and any future therapies, enabling a better understanding of which treatment is best for which patient and at which time, and really helps to avoid fragmented or siloed approaches for the collection of real-world data. Next slide, please. So the use of disease registries can have broad application, and what I'd like to highlight here is their use in reimbursement submissions. And as previously noted, much of what we know about SMA treatment in adults comes from the real-world experience. And these real-world data have helped to secure treatment access for the adult patient population in some countries where access was previously restricted due to lack of clinical trial data. And so as a good example of this, there was a pooled registry analysis done across several European countries, including Italy, Germany, and Spain, which demonstrated the benefits of treatment in SMA patients. And this pooled registry analysis really played a role in expanding access and reimbursement for SMA patients in the UK who had lost the ability to walk. And the pooling of data was important to ensure adequate sample sizes for a rare disease among important subgroups in the SMA population. And it was really enabled by utilizing established registries whose infrastructure had been built up over several years that adhered to a common core data set and had similar data quality controls, and that collected data on potential confounding characteristics that were defined in similar ways. If we could advance the slides, thank you. That would be great, and we can move forward. So in an evolving treatment landscape with multiple available therapies, there will be and there is a need to conduct valid and robust comparative effectiveness analyses. And while substantial real-world data have been generated on nusinersen use, most available data across the other therapies is really within the context of clinical trials. And this has really led to an inability to conduct robust indirect treatment comparisons to date due to limited sample sizes, lack of access to patient-level data on both trials, variations in trial designs, and also key differences in inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so the registries, when we think about how they will be helpful to us moving forward, really provide a good opportunity to do these meaningful comparative effectiveness analyses due to the larger number of patients that may allow for adequate matching on clinical characteristics to account for those important confounding influences. There are certainly challenges as we think ahead to this, and adequate planning is certainly needed to ensure that robust analyses can be done. And these would include differences in follow-up assessments and timing of assessments across the treatments. And there's also really an importance of establishing pre-specified analysis plans that adhere to best practice guidelines. And in rare disease, where there are limited numbers of patients and available data sources to conduct valid comparative analyses, it will also be important that they're led by the clinical and statistical experts when possible to ensure that they're is a level of independence in these comparisons, and it will also help bolster confidence in any conclusions that can be drawn from such analyses. So as we move to the next slide, we'll see, a number of different considerations for disease registries as we really are trying to generate robust real-world data. So certainly not all registries will serve all purposes, but especially for the larger registries, that we're hopeful can serve multiple purposes, it's important to increase the interoperability of the data to allow for potential pooling of data across registries. We need to ensure high quality data standards, really working to minimizing bias. And when we think about pre-specified statistical analysis plans, it's important to think about ensuring that they are done in a flexible way that can really account for the challenges that are seen when working with real-world data. And the real way in which the registries will have influences over the longer term. So we are very considered in working with registries to help to find a sustainable approach for them over time, which includes issues around having multiple funding sources and clear and transparent data sharing rules. And as you'll see, most of the work that's been done in SMA has focused on the motor function assessments, the key motor function scores. But as we continue to advance real-world data generation broadly and in registries specifically, it's really important and critical to think about how to best include, those patient relevant outcomes. So next slide. So what I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about some of the publications, the independent publications that have really examined the use of nusinersen in the adult patient population. And what we'll see is that these studies have included a broad range of adults with SMA. So the first study that I'd like to focus on is a multi-center study by Hagenecker and colleagues. And on the next slide, we'll see the design of the study. So this was a prospective observational cohort study from 10 academic clinical sites that leveraged the SmartCare SMA Disease Registry in Germany. And the study included patients ages 60 to 65 at the time of nusinersen initiation across SMA, all SMA types. But as would be expected in an adult patient population, nearly all were type 2 or type 3, with about 35% being type 2 and 65% being type 3. And as a reminder of what Susie mentioned earlier, patients with type 2 are those with symptom onset in early childhood, who in the absence of disease-modifying therapy would typically attain the maximum motor milestone of sitting, whereas the type 3 patients are those who do attain the ability to walk independently. But as also mentioned previously, many of these patients do lose the ability to walk by adulthood due to the continued progressive nature in SMA. So it won't be surprising when we look at the results to see a mix of ambulatory and non-ambulatory type 3 patients in this study. As shown here on the slide, the investigators then assessed patients at set intervals. This is certainly well-reasoned given the administration schedule for nusinersen. So nusinersen is an antisense oligonucleotide that's administered via lumbar puncture. And the dosing regimen consists of 4 loading doses followed by maintenance doses, starting at 6 months after treatment initiation. And then they're given 4 months every 4 months thereafter. So that accounts for why we see follow-ups at 6 months, 10 months, and 14 months within the study. The endpoints considered in this study were the 3 validated motor function scales in SMA that are most frequently used with adult patients. So we see the Hammersmith Functional Motor Scale, expanded version, which can be used with type 2 and type 3 patients, as well as ambulatory and non-ambulatory individuals, and is used to assess upper and lower limb function. The revised upper limb module was really developed for use among non-ambulatory patients, but can be used with ambulatory patients, and is used to assess activities of daily living related to upper limb function. And then the 6-minute walk test is used to measure walking distance among ambulatory patients. And these scales are often performed by physiotherapists. So it's noteworthy, particularly within the context of this study and some of the other studies, to say that the physiotherapists that were evaluating patients in this study were part of a training program to help ensure that reliable and valid data on the motor assessments were obtained. So in the next slide, we'll see the baseline characteristics for the participants that were evaluated at each time point after treatment initiation. So there were a considerable number of patients, 124 in total, that were assessed at 6 months. And that when you look across the figure here, what you'll see is that the number of patients is shown to decrease over time. But it's important to note that this is largely because patients entered treatment at different points in time and really hadn't reached the longer lengths of follow-up when the data analysis was conducted. It really, according to the authors, wasn't due to loss to follow-up or treatment discontinuation. And to this point, I think only 4 patients discontinued treatment during the study period. And as we can see here, there are distributions of other key clinical characteristics. 30%, 37% were ambulatory, which again highlights the predicted loss of ambulation among some of the type 3 patients. So moving forward, you'll see a summary of the effectiveness outcomes. These are the findings among all of the patients. And what we see are demonstrated statistically significant increases in motor function over time from nusinersen administration to 6 months, 10 months, and 14 months of follow-up. So for example, on HFMSE scores, we see an average of over a 3-point increase in scores from baseline. The scores do seem to increase over time, but of course we should be somewhat cautious in this interpretation, given that different individuals are contributing to the analyses at different time points. And when we look at, clinically meaningful increases in Hammersmith scores over time, we see that 40% achieved a gain of 3 or more points at 14 months of follow-up. But I will say that many experts, including the authors, suggest that in this progressive disease, that stability would also be a clinically meaningful endpoint, not just an increase in scores. And to put these data into context, based on natural history studies, we would anticipate an average decline of about 0.5 point to 1 point per year. The slide here also shows that for room and 6-minute walk tests, there are average increases in scores over time through 14 months of treatment as well. So if we move forward, I do want to note that the authors did report that motor function improvement was related to disease verity at baseline. So as you'll know, and as you'll remember, the adult population is quite heterogeneous. So on the next slide, we'll see some of the subgroup analyses that were performed by these investigators to really look at potential modifiers of treatment response. And what we see here is really a consistent pattern of patients with higher baseline functioning having mean increases in HFMSE scores through 14 months of treatment. So those with higher versus lower baseline HFMSE scores, those with no history of spinal degeneration or spondylosis, those who are ambulant, and those with type 3 versus type 2 SMA had somewhat greater improvements in their scores over time. Next slide. And this is just a brief slide to comment on safety. We see that of those, 173 patients who received at least 1 dose of nusinersen, about 40% 7% of them experienced any adverse event. And the most commonly occurring adverse events were headache, back pain, and nausea. And these are adverse events that are often reported in the context of a lumbar puncture. Next slide. So when we're evaluating, these real world data, it's important to consider the strengths of these studies, including the fact that in a rare disease, this is a rather large patient population. It is multi-center with outcomes through 14 months. And there were exploratory analyses that were done. But of course, with any real world examination of clinical data, there are certainly limitations that should also be considered, which we'll see on the next slide. So it is certainly important to note that this was a single arm study. The lack of a control or untreated arm, though, is not surprising, given that standardized motor function assessments were not routinely collected among adult patients prior to the treatment era. The study included a heterogeneous cohort, which reflects the patient population seen in clinical practice and is noted by the investigators who examined potential modifiers of treatment response. They did find that while average increases in scores were greater in some subgroups than others, that statistically significant increases in motor function were found through 14 months across a number of different subgroups. And while HFMSE is a validated assessment tool, it certainly may not be sensitive to changes in the strongest and weakest patients, which is another reason why it's important to consider additional assessment tools, as the investigators did here by including the Rollman and 6-minute walk test. So on the next slide, we'll see the author's conclusions. And after assessing the study findings, they concluded that the study showed the safety and efficacy of nusinersen treatment in adult patients with SMA, with statistically significant improvements in motor function observed at all time points. And if we go to the next slide, I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about another large multi-center study that took place in Italy. And the study design is shown on the next slide. And in contrast to Hagenecker, this was a retrospective observational study that was conducted across 18 Italian centers treating adults with nusinersen. And the study population was limited to those who are 18 years of age with type 2 or type 3 SMA at the time of treatment initiation. On the next slide, we'll see some of the baseline characteristics. Again, we have a heterogeneous patient population, and this is reflected in the range of motor function scores at baseline. But here it's particularly important to note that the vast majority of patients were type 3 with only a small number of type 2 patients included. And those type 3 patients did vary in terms of their ability to walk. Next slide. What we see here are some of the key effectiveness findings through 14 months of follow-up. And as with Hagenecker, the number of patients contributing data to the later time points is lower because patients had not yet reached that follow-up assessment in their treatment histories by the analysis. And for motor function outcomes, the total results are shown for type 3 patients because this was the most sizable group. And then amongst subgroups of the type 3 patients based on ambulatory status. And I'll just focus here on HFMSE results, for example. What we see is an increase in HFMSE scores across time, and that the changes in scores were significant amongst both the non-ambulatory and walker subgroups. We also see some effects for the revised upper limb module as well as the 6-minute walk test. Now, Maggi also presented results for what they call overall responders. So showing a response in either HFMSE, roam, or 6-minute walk test. And what you'll see is that by 14 months of follow-up, 70% of type 3 patients showed a response on one or more of these scales. And even though we had small sample sizes, there was a high frequency of response in SMA type 2 patients, really suggesting that even patients with poor motor function at baseline may benefit from nusinersen. And if we move forward to the next slide, we'll see a similar safety profile as reported by Hagenacker. Next slide. In terms of the limitations, of course, we need to consider the retrospective study design and the limitations that come with that, including, there being missing data for some variables. There was also a small proportion of patients who were SMA type 2, but that was really reflective of the patients seen in clinical practice in Italy. Next slide. So based on their assessment of the data, the authors concluded that the studies provided real-world evidence of nusinersen safety and efficacy in adult patient with SMAs type 2 and 3, with the efficacy benefits in SMA type 3 appearing to be cumulative over time. So if we move forward, I'd just like to spend a few minutes.
Angela, sorry to interrupt really briefly. If you could keep this one really short at the tops of the trees, because we have, thank you so much.
Absolutely. So there was a recent meta-analysis by Karate and colleagues that sought to synthesize, the growing literature, amongst adult patients and children in terms of their nusinersen use. And they provided both, a systematic literature review and a quantitative synthesis of the data. And there are a couple of slides that I'd like to point to, because I just think that they're actually quite visual, and all we need is the ocular test in order to see, the pattern of the observed findings. So if you move forward, I'll stop you right here. If you go back, Angela. What you'll see is a very busy, what looks to be a very busy figure, but it's actually a bit, simplistic if we break it down. So these are the results we see from the systematic literature research of the 15 studies reporting HFMSE results for treated adults and a handful of studies on untreated results. And what I'll ask you to focus on is really the middle panel. And what we see here is, in a traditional forest plot approach, is really the mean change in scores over time for each study, and along with the confidence interval shown by the error bars. And what you see is, if you look down, that middle panel, all of the studies of treated adult patients show positive effects. So if you look at that black line, that's your line of no association. So all of the studies of treated patients show positive changes over time. Whereas if you look at the bottom panel, what you see is really the opposite effect. All of the studies amongst untreated patients are really showing a decline over time, even amongst adult patients. And I'll just focus on this one particular slide, but you see a similar pattern of findings, when you look at each of the outcomes in adult and child patients. So there really is, an emerging and consistent pattern of evidence, suggesting, the efficacy, the effectiveness, as well as the safety of nusinersen in adult type 2 and type 3 patients. So with that, I think I will turn it back so we can move to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Angela. That was great. And Susie, I appreciated your interpretation in the chat panel about what some of these outcomes mean for patients. We've got an incredible panel to jump in, and Susie and Angela, please stick around if you can, because there may be some questions back to you. We're going to start with Bruce. You heard off the top with what Angela presented that clinician researchers were really a key part of this development of RWE, real world evidence. Are you taking part in some of these programs right now, and where do you see this going in Canada? Let's bring this back to Canada in particular, if you wouldn't mind, Bruce.
Yeah, so my what I'm particularly interested in is the biology that underlies response and harm. So all drugs, all cars, you could say at the same thing, are both beneficial and potentially harmful to patients. And I'm really interested in the tails. I'm interested in those patients who are super responders to these agents, not exclusively. This is my laboratory work. And I'm also interested in those that experience worsening of their disease or are harmed by therapy. Many of the papers don't really do a good job. The last review, for example, didn't look at safety at all. And so I'm really interested in what happens to those tails of patients. Why I'm interested in that is because those provide the goalposts that I want to aim for in patient treatment. If I can understand the biology that underlies super response, I've got a population that I can benchmark others against for that holy grail of comparative evidence. So I'm really interested in those patients. This isn't an issue of access, by the way. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking really about evidence and how that would help us understand what makes those patients different. And by the way, all drugs are like this. I mean, as the head of a division of clinical pharmacology, I mean, there are patients that have these sort of incredible responses, and then those that don't. And when you deal with heterogeneous conditions like SMA, it's often very difficult to figure out what is the best endpoint for individual patients. So when I say super response, I mean, the patient needs to tell us that, more than the clinician. I need to understand, what is it about? We talked a lot about motor function today, but what about respiratory function, for example, or safety? How does it make you feel? And that's what I'm really interested in. That's where I think the work could be really helpful, understanding the biology response. It's hard to argue against funding super responders, by the way, because they do respond. And then the question is, where do you go from there? But that's really what the biology in my lab is focused on.
Thanks, Bruce. That's terrific. Fred, would you mind jumping in terms of where Pfizer is going? Maybe react to what you've heard from our colleague in Massachusetts. What's happening in Canada from what Pfizer's doing here to try to build out the infrastructure that Angela started talking about off the bat?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So maybe I could answer it in a couple of pieces. So the first off is, how in the rare disease space do we currently work with registries that's in place when we're looking at real world evidence? I think what's interesting as I listen to the discussion is, if you look at what Angela presented and then, what Bruce had mentioned, are we looking at the registries and as Pfizer approaches this as well, is it for access? Because the way, the what, and the when will vary. Is it for clinical efficacy over time? Is it working with Health Canada to show safety, over time? So when we look at this, of course, depending on how we're going to and where do we work, and also what does real world evidence and what does real world data, big data look like, will differ. So from a Pfizer perspective, what we're thinking about right now is we bring pipeline molecules, can we work with infrastructures that's there and build on that? Also with the real world, with the framework that Health Canada is putting in place, can we also recommend investments into these areas to help people and community centers of excellence to expand? Because in collecting data collection is important. How you work with individuals, how you work with clinicians, how you work with caregivers, all that's important of how you bring data in. So Pfizer is also working there as well. And then finally, if we go to the access world, it's one of, so what I can tell you is we have partnered on a small scale, because in doing this initially, we looked at partnering with a payer, so a willing payer with a outcome that we feel is agreeable to be able to represent value and also to take into account risk. Is it measurable over time? And then on this one, because it's a small scale, can it be done on an individual patient basis to look at value over time, or do we have to look at it from an aggregate perspective to look at value over time? And on this one, we decided to go with patient by patient. But that's also something that's very important as we go into linking real world data to access. And I think what would be in my last comment is, and this is from a Pfizer, and I think, maybe from any industry partner, I'm not sort of teeing up a question for Brent here, but, when can the process, when we kind of look at the collection of real world evidence and real world data, fit into the processes that's already in place? CADTH review, INES review, PCPA, because as Angela highlighted, if you look on the side of clinical research, observational trials, you could see the cadre of different endpoints that's required. That will be very complex, I think, if we look at trying to work with PCPA on each one of those. I'm not saying that's not possible, but I'm just thinking practically with anyone kind of working that out, versus how do you look at essence of what is truly need to be measured to be able to show value for a payer. But anyway, I'll let Brent sort of speak to that. So this is how Pfizer is sort of looking at these things currently.
Maybe we'll just jump to Brent, because you did set him up there, and then we'll come back to Allison in terms of what's happening from Inumar's perspective. Brent, do you want to jump in on what Fred was pointing out in terms of PCPA? I mean, you used to sit in that chair as a payer. Now you're as the national, or I should say, a pan-Canadian HTA provider. Fred, you said a willing payer as opposed to the group. I don't know if you want to jump in and comment on that, Brent.
So I can't really speak on behalf of PCPA. They've got their own priorities and work pressures. So how the agreements can be negotiated after our recommendations really falls within their bailiwick. What I can say, though, is that CADTH does accept RWE or RWD information as part of the submission. We do consider this as complementary to randomized controlled trials, particularly to address where there may be gaps in evidence that are available to date. What we would encourage manufacturers to do is to engage with us as quickly as possible or early in the process, so that the folks that focus on RWE within CADTH are able to look at the data that's being collected, where that information is coming from, so we can look at things like data standards, quality, and they can provide some guidance to the manufacturer around how to possibly present that information as part of their submission. So I would assume the extension of that is then if PCPA is going to be looking at outcome-based type of an agreement, that they would then look at the clinical components of our reviews to help inform some of their guidance and recommendations on how to implement.
Thanks so much, Brent. Allison, over to you. The national versus the specific down to the individual basis. I mean, any thoughts on where Inumar is going to be able to support some of these registries and RWE?
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. We utilize the patient support programs, and they almost become a mini registry in of themselves, because we can follow the patient journey across, especially if you look at the robustness of where we can get data at initiation of enrollment, looking back even historically on diagnosis, the opportunity to provide surveys through the program. And then also as we look to within the program, touch points that we have that we can offer these surveys. The other areas that we are looking at, I can just highlight, is supplementing not just the patient support program, but where there's some gaps in the data. Manufacturers don't always consider RWE when they're launching the program. And we have some manufacturers come to us 5-6 years later that have been having maybe some reimbursement challenges. And they see the robustness of the PSP data, but there are some gaps. And that's where we really believe patient registries come into play. By partnering with a patient registry, you can supplement those data gaps and write a firm protocol together and do publications. And we also, that's where we believe too, the KOLs, the key opinion leaders within Canada really have a strong voice in helping write the protocol. Oftentimes we're using a lot of their data sets, doing, chart reviews, chart audits within their practices to supplement those data sets. And then also working towards a publication. But really, I think asking the questions is, what is the challenge that we're trying to overcome with real world evidence? We highlighted a lot of them already in some of the speakers is it a reimbursement opportunity? And from those, we're seeing a lot more around product listing agreements and outcomes-based agreements. So one of the areas I think that we need to focus on in Canada is utilizing these great data sets, but then utilizing it with the reimbursement challenges and working more strongly on outcomes-based agreements. We do realize that they are sometimes hard to administer and collect, but I really do believe outcomes-based agreements for the future will really enable patients to get the access that they need.
Thanks, Allison. Durhan, you're back on a plane a fair amount these days, including some global travel, I understand. What have you seen that's been happening in the UK and in Germany? And you don't even have to go that far, because Susie mentioned Quebec, and Quebec approved one of the products for anyone who could potentially benefit from it. Any lessons from overseas, and then maybe back to Susie on why was Quebec different, and what motivated that decision versus the other jurisdictions?
Well, let me say that in Canada, and kudos to CADIF actually for their recent strategic plan. I think if they can actually execute on all that, it fits where we're going with the rare disease drug strategy. And that is the ability to, I think as everybody says, to be able to provide access to that therapy with the evidence that's been collected in terms of clinical trials and on the approval basis, but looking beyond that, right? So what other populations, and especially when the approval includes them in the labeling, because what we see is that the regulator says, okay, we see this, but we also believe it's there. And I think the challenge is certainly for, payers, right, is oftentimes, where's the certainty here? Am I actually going to be putting money into, therapies and for patients where I'm going to likely get some return on that investment? And okay, that sounds a little harsh, but that is the way it works. And I think what we're looking for is that greater flexibility. And what we've seen in Europe, of course, is that ability to have a much more, comprehensive approach. Start off with the opportunity to include patients rather than to exclude them. I mean, there's the question, right? If there's uncertainty, I can either bring them in or I can keep them out. If I can bring them in, but put together a monitoring program, I think as Angela and others have seen, then we can move forward and be able to collect information. Are we willing to give people that chance that? I mean, I think what Bruce says is really strong though, and that is there are people who are going to be on that end of the spectrum. What do we do with them? We have to be able to continue to collect the information that allows us to be able to say, because some people are not going to respond. Some people are going to get adverse effects to them. How do we catch them? How do we catch them early? And that's again where that patient registry and the monitoring comes into place. Now, who's going to do that? How we're going to do that goes back to what we're saying in this drug strategy. And you've heard me say it, and everybody hopefully on this call has heard me say it over and over again. We need investment in infrastructure. We need investment in patient registries. We need investment in centers of excellence where we can collect that information. We need investment in terms of data analysts who can actually do that. More than anything else, we also need to be internationally connected. That's why I'm really thrilled with what Angela is presenting and how that's being done. And maybe even more than anything else, and we're going to hear it next week. So this is my plug for you guys joining us for next week. We need collaboration. We need to bring together international collaboration, certainly in terms of centers, but we need collaboration between the industry and the payers. And that's where we've seen the advances happening in the UK, in Germany, in France, even in the Netherlands, even in Belgium, where people are saying, we're on the same side here, you guys. We all want the same thing. We want to bring in these innovations as quickly as possible. But yes, the money's got to be well spent and it's got to be sustainable. So can we collaborate to do that? That to me is the essence of what we need to have. And I will say, honestly, I don't think we have a collaborative approach in Canada. Where does Canada fall down on this? We are too much, seeing this as a bit of an at odds, antagonistic. And, we've talked a lot in the PMPRB, how can we kind of keep innovation, costs down? Well, we'll do it by, axing them out of the system, as opposed to saying, how do we negotiate better on this? So that was my long-winded answer to say, I think all of this makes sense, but we've got to do it in a real collaboration. So I think what Fred said earlier, and how do we go about doing this makes a great deal of sense to me.
Yeah. Angela, have you seen jurisdictions in particular that have done this well and taken up those some of the outcomes that you've been measuring where you're sitting in Boston?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do take to heart the comment about, collaborating, having those open discussions, very early and sustained over time. I think that is very helpful, but also having some clear guidance and guidelines, I think is very important to this, and I work globally. And so it would be nice to see even greater collaboration across different payers, right? Coming to some sort of consensus about, what real world data packages should look like when they're submitted, so that we can, create the most robust package possible, and, use it for multiple different situations. So I do think collaboration here is certainly clear. And, from the industry perspective, I think good, clear guidance is also very welcome in the space.
Just bumping up against the hour, do you think I can give Brent, do you want to just react to that in terms of what CADF is doing as a bit of a convener or potentially a clearinghouse for RWE? What's the best way to describe what CADF is doing?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a or can't remember what the clearinghouse. We are going through sort of a learning period right now, and Nicole and Lori are leading this work within CADF. One of the pieces of work that the advisory committee, which includes Health Canada, is looking at, and includes some membership from industry and various groups, and I think that's part of the work you're on doing, is looking at providing some guidance documents so that people do understand what information has to be collected or should be collected for the submissions. It really depends on what the question is, as been mentioned earlier. Where are the gaps and what information is available? But I think it's just understanding the quality of the data, just where there may be some challenges within the data, just talking about that early so that this information can be presented in the best manner possible. We also have updated our website to include a microsite, which I can put in the chat function. Unfortunately, I do have to leave right after this, so my apologies, but I'll put a link in the chat function, which is really just a primer on real world evidence. And that gives you a sense of kind of where our thoughts are at this point in time.
Can I just jump in half a second before Brent leaves? My only comment back to you guys is really exciting what you're saying, and the committees and the engagement. Don't be so timid. We do not need to do so many pilot projects in terms of looking backwards. We need to invest in prospective, patient registries. We need to, invest in prospective real world evidence projects, but we also need to take some of these therapies that are coming in and set them up. And as Lori said over and over again, let's just do it. We don't have to wait until we've got a full, set of understanding in terms of what that is. So the only hesitancy I would say that I have in where that strategy is going sounds still a little bit too timid, but it's great work I think that you're embarking on. So kudos to you guys.
Thanks, Derhane, and certainly I agree with many of your points. I think the other part, though, it's not just us that's kind of involved in the equation of finalizing this work. So there's other people that we need to consider as well. So,
okay, Bruce, thanks so much, Brent. We'll catch you next time, and hopefully in person soon. Take care.
Yep.
Bruce, I mean, I don't know how much longer you want to go for, Durhan, and a lot of people are sticking around, and this is obviously a very important topic. Just before we get to Bruce, how long do you want to go for, Durhan?
You know what, you go, until we see people significantly fall off. Why don't you do that? Because it is an important discussion and it sets us up brilliantly for next week. So keep talking.
Okay, excellent. So Bruce.
I was just going to say that in the area of rare disease, I agree with Durhan. I'm a little bit frustrated by the lack of progress and the movement to create the data sources that we have available for patient outcomes that are particularly important. And there are some examples of doing this very well in rare disease. Pediatric cancer is an area that's near and dear to my heart, and this is a perfect example. In British Columbia, 5.1 million people, we have about 120 new cancer diagnoses in children from 0 to 18 a year. That's it, 120 in 5.1 million people. So it's a rare disease. And when you include all of its subtypes, solid tumors, leukemias, everything, it's still a rare disease. That's the total number. And what we've seen since the 1950s, when the Children's Oncology Group first started, is an increase in survival from about 25% to today, which is higher than 80% in British Columbia. And the 5-year survival from pediatric cancer in the United States is at 80% across all tumor types. It's a bit higher in British Columbia. And so that's a phenomenal success. And it is largely through a variety of trial types, sometimes randomized controlled trials, not always. But what's most impressive, I think, about COG is that, for example, in 2019, in May, an updated protocol for the treatment of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, standard risk was completed, a trial was completed across member institutions. And 5 months later, in October, the changes were already implemented and being used in practice. There was no, oh, the research is done, now we have to sit down and figure out how we're going to use this. It was actually part of the implementation plan. And so the entire treatment regimen was updated within 5 months of those results being published and move forward. So there are some examples of how we can actually do this and learn from these experiences in these conditions, which are highly variable, right? I mean, there aren't that many brain tumors in children, and they can range in severity from survivable to those that aren't. And we've learned quite a bit over time as we move forward. And so I think, using some of those examples, in the United States, 360 odd million people, 14,000 cases of pediatric leukemia, pediatric cancer a year in total, 14,000. So these are small numbers. But if we can, again, getting to what Durhan said, if we can work internationally with each other, there's a lot that we can accomplish here together. And so I do a lot of work on using the human genome to understand the biology of response and how it differs between patients. And the idea is to come up with better interventional strategies to actually enhance response in those that don't normally respond, or in those that are harmed, to come up with ways to protect them so that they can receive effective therapy without that harm. And so I think these are all possible and probable if we put our minds to it. I just wanted to say that.
Those are tiny numbers, Bruce. Thanks for putting pediatric cancer in perspective as a rare condition. And then it's super heterogeneous even among those. Any final thoughts from Susie, Allison, Fred, before we wrap this one up? And this is all going to go on Cord's YouTube channel. As Durhan, as you said, this will feed really well into the next webinar. But any final thoughts before I turn it back to you, Durhan, to wrap it up?
Yeah, I have a final thought and just something to think about. This disease, this treatment, one of the problems that we've been fighting with from the start is setting precedents for other diseases, and having approval for our treatment in this disease you know, having the problem of other diseases trying to access treatment. So there's fear of approving for adults for this treatment outside of the inclusion criteria, outside of the submission. So that is a burden that we've had to carry as a patient group. Another one is in Europe, we have broader access for Spinraza for adult patients. So broad, in fact, that we have Ukrainian refugees moving over to Poland and receiving treatment over in Poland. Yet here in Canada, we have to justify and justify again and have proof beyond what all these other countries have already approved by the data that was already submitted, including the real world evidence. We have over 3,000 patients worldwide that are adults that are accessing treatment. It's a cop-out from our perspective that we're not utilizing that data that is usable by other countries.
Thanks so much. So I guess the takeaway is don't wait for perfection, collect the data in real time, provide access and continue to collect the data. And then recalibrate these, I guess what they would call it, Durhan in the UK, managed access schemes or managed access programs, right? Is that it? And so do you want to lead us into next week and give people a heads up of what's next, Durhan?
Yeah, thanks to everybody who's hanging on with us. Next week, we are going to talk about setting up smart drug systems and what the smart access look like. And we're going to drill down a little bit on what's happening in the UK. We're going to drill down a little bit in terms of what's happening in Australia with their new, contract between Medicines Australia and the health and kind of where rare disease is sitting in that. Going to look a little bit across different countries and how they're approaching the issue of modernizing access to drugs for rare diseases. This is for us the opportunity, and I say very strongly, we've got to start having smart. And if we can have a smart rare disease drug system, we can do, I think what the UK has been saying, we're going to support innovation and we're going to bring in research, we're going to bring in clinical trials, but we're also going to make sure it's affordable. We're going to be able to do what the US has always been doing, so not doing so well on the affordability side, but that is stimulating innovation and making sure it's affordability. For me, the two words we're going to be pushing for is that we want to make sure that we have accelerated access. As Susie saying, in terms of innovation, we need to be at the front of that and we need to have sustainability. So if we can build a smart drug system that uses, smart planning, that uses smart tools, and that really is able to, be agile in terms of these new therapies that are coming in, we're going to be, at the top. So I encourage everybody to join us next week. You'll see an agenda on it. And huge thanks to our panelists. Huge thanks to Bill, as always, for doing the moderation. And really best thanks to Angela Parody for bringing in that very comprehensive presentation and really having us understand kind of what real world evidence can come from and how it can really inform us. And so looking forward to moving it forward. SMA is a little bit of a poster child because it's in a really fortuitous position in terms of having data and having patients that have been enrolled. So we can't just allow that to be just fortuitous. We need to create those registries as well. And we need to make sure Canada is part of that. So huge thanks to everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.